All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on a book that's been making the rounds, Your Brain on Porn by Gary Wilson. A lot of you have asked us to take a closer look at it, specifically the claims being made, so that's exactly what we're going to do. We've got some interesting research to dig into, and let me tell you, get ready for some surprises.
Oh, this is going to be a good one. I mean, this book gets held up as like the authority on pornography. So, yeah, taking a closer look at how it's all put together should be, well, eye-opening at the very least.
You weren't kidding. Like, you kind of assume someone writing a book like this would have, some serious credentials. And I'll admit, I was pretty surprised to find out that Gary Wilson wasn't actually a doctor, a scientist, or even a therapist. Turns out he was a massage therapist. Public records show he taught massage classes, actually.
See, that's where the background research really comes in handy. Because, yeah, at first glance, that detail might not seem like such a big deal. But when you really think about it, it does make you wonder, what perspective he was coming from, right? Especially since his book, well, it gained so much traction, became this big voice in all these discussions about porn.
And it doesn't stop there, right? I mean, as we dug deeper, we found this whole other layer to the story. Apparently, Wilson was really involved in this movement called Caressa. Basically, it's this whole philosophy that centers around, well, a very specific way of approaching sex.
Yeah, and the interesting part is that a core belief in Caressa is that avoiding certain types of intense sexual pleasure, they're very particular about what that means, by the way, is like the path to spiritual enlightenment.
Okay, so now this is where it starts to get really, really interesting. Because in your brain on porn, Wilson talks a lot about things like, sexual abstinence as part of what he calls recovery. So then you learn about this Caressa connection, and it kind of makes you wonder if his own personal beliefs could have actually made their way into the book's message.
Oh, absolutely. That's a question we're going to keep circling back to as we break down some of the book's main claims, especially how Wilson uses those personal stories, those anecdotes, to try and back up his arguments. I mean, he includes a whopping 226 of them, supposedly all from people who are, dealing with what he calls pornography addiction. You'd think with that many stories, there'd be like mountains of evidence to support him, right?
Right. Like, you'd at least expect some solid documentation, maybe even some crossover where other sources can back up what these stories are saying. But, and this is a big but, that's not what we found at all. Get this. A huge chunk of these anecdotes, they only pop up on, get this, Wilson's own personal website or on internet forums that are, well, let's just say they're pretty closely tied to anti-masturbation movement.
And those are not exactly what I'd call the most neutral or unbiased platforms out there. It's kind of like if you wanted to get a sense of what life is like in a whole city, but you only talk to people like one very specific club. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah.
So it's not just that these stories are coming from a place that might already have a very specific viewpoint, but it sounds like there are concerns about how legit they even are.
Right, and that's the big thing. He's presenting these anecdotes as evidence, proof, but when you actually try to, check if they hold up, you hit a wall. A lot of them lack what we call source verification. There's just no way to tell if what we're reading is the real deal, an accurate portrayal of what these supposed people actually went through.
It's like finding out that this miracle cure you saw advertised online, it's all based on like anonymous testimonials. No way to know if these people are even real. And speaking of things that are kind of iffy, there's that whole thing with Wilson claiming he has a doctorate. We went down that rabbit hole, and the closest thing we could dig up was that apparently he was an undergraduate lab assistant for a bit.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a pattern we're seeing here when you say these inconsistencies, these little things that make you go, okay. And the unfortunate part is this pattern, it pops up again when you start looking at how he uses actual scientific research throughout the book, which, well, that's a whole other can of worms we're about to crack open.
So we've got these anecdotes, these stories, and, well, their origins are kind of shaky, right? And now we're moving on to, like, the research itself. It's like, I don't know, trying to build a house on, like, a foundation of sand. You'd hope the research in the book like this would be, rock solid.
Right. You'd think so, especially with how often people hold up your brain on porn as this, like, science-backed expose. Right. But then we actually start digging into the citations, the research he's using, and, well, let's just say we found some pretty big discrepancies. Like, right off the bat, a lot of the sources he's using, they're not even peer-reviewed scientific studies. We're talking blog posts, websites with very clear agendas, even, get this, YouTube videos.
Hold on. He's citing YouTube videos in a book about the science of addiction. Is this for real?
Dead serious. And it's not just that some of these sources are, well, let's just say questionable. It's that there's this whole pattern of, I don't know, almost like he's trying to make the scientific backing seem a lot stronger than it actually is. We found tons of duplicate citations, like he's trying to make it look like way more research supports what he's saying.
It's like writing a 5-page essay and trying to pass it off as 10 pages by double spacing it.
Yeah.
Like, I see what you did there, but it's not going to fly if you're trying to actually make a real argument.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. A good chunk of the research he does cite, it's not even about pornography or addiction. It's like he's pulling from studies on totally different stuff and hoping no one will notice that there's, like, zero connection to his claims.
So it's like using a recipe for, like, chocolate chip cookies and trying to bake a cake. I mean, yeah, there might be some ingredients in common, but you're not going to end up with what you thought you were making.
And that's what's worrying here, right? This isn't just some academic debate. What he's saying in this book, it has real-world implications. People are using it to make decisions about their relationships, their health, how they see themselves.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And that just makes it even more important to really, really look at the information being presented, right?
Yeah.
Especially, considering what we talked about earlier with those anecdotes being, well, edited.
Oh, right, yeah. We kind of touched on it before, but it's worth digging into a bit more. It seems like he made some pretty big changes to those original stories he got.
Like what kind of changes? Give me an example.
Okay, so there's this one anecdote about this guy, right? He was dealing with what he thought was like a sexual problem. And in the original story, the guy talks about seeing a sex worker. Well, guess what? That whole detail completely gone from the version that ends up in your brain on porn.
Wow. Okay, so it's not like he was just like fixing typos or something. He was changing the whole story.
Exactly. And it feels very intentional, you know? It's hard not to see how talking about sex work, even in the context of this guy trying to, like, fix something he thought was wrong, wouldn't exactly line up with that whole Karetsa philosophy, right?
Yeah.
With its focus on monogamy and a very specific way of experiencing sex.
So it's like he's like picking and choosing the parts that fit what he wants to say.
Yeah.
Even if it means changing the whole story. And that's a little messed up, don't you think? I mean, not everyone's going to know to look for these inconsistencies or like think about the biases he might have. They could read this book and think it's like the absolute truth.
And that's exactly why we do these deep dives. It's not about telling anyone what to think about your brain on porn or any other book or article. It's about giving you guys, the listeners, the tools you need to, figure things out for yourselves.
So what's the takeaway here? What should people keep in mind after listening to all of this?
Honestly, don't just believe everything you read, even if it sounds really convincing at first. Take a second, ask yourself some questions. Who wrote this? What makes them an expert? Is there something, maybe even subconsciously, that could be swaying their perspective?
It's like, what's that saying? Don't judge a book by its cover. Fancy design, lots of footnotes, all that science-y language. It doesn't mean anything if the content's not legit.
100%. Scratch beneath the surface. Take a good hard look at the claims being made. Is there solid evidence to back it up? From trustworthy sources, are there other viewpoints out there that should be considered?
And what about this whole porn addiction thing? Where does that leave us?
It's complicated. There's still a lot of research being done, lots of debate. Look, what we've talked about today, it doesn't take away from the very real struggles people face if they feel like their relationship with pornography is unhealthy or, causing them problems. Those experiences are valid. But it does make you think, right, is addiction really the right way to understand what's going on? And how do we make sure the treatment approaches are, actually helpful and ethical?
It's a good reminder that nothing is as simple as it seems.
Preach. A healthy dose of skepticism and some good old-fashioned critical thinking, it's more important than ever, especially these days when we're bombarded with information from every direction and everyone's got an angle.
So next time you come across a book or an article making big claims, remember this conversation. Ask the tough questions. Think critically. Trust me, your understanding of the world and yourself will be all the richer for it. And that's it for our deep dive on Your Brain on Porn. We'll see you next time.